Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel and stay updated on more historical stories. The Genocide of the Roma, Gypsies, in Nazi Europe, Part 4. Survival, Resistance, and the Voices of the Victims. Amid the machinery of destruction that defined Nazi Europe, survival for Roma people was rare and often accidental. Those who lived through ghettos, camps, forced labor, and mass executions did so under conditions that stripped them of rights, identity, and dignity. Yet even in these circumstances, acts of resistance, solidarity, and human resilience endured. Part 4 focuses on those who survived, how they resisted, and what their experiences reveal about a genocide long ignored. Survival against the odds. Roma survival depended on many factors: geography, timing, chance, and sometimes the decisions of individual guards or local officials. Some survived by being assigned to forced labor, others by escaping during transports, or by hiding with sympathetic families. In rural areas, a small number of Roma managed to evade arrest by fleeing into forests or remote regions. These groups lived in hiding for months or even years, surviving on foraged food and assistance from local populations. Discovery often meant immediate execution. In camps, survival was often tied to physical strength. Those deemed fit for labor had slightly higher chances of staying alive, though exhaustion and disease constantly threatened them. Even then, survival rarely meant safety. It meant postponement of death. Acts of resistance. Roma resistance took many forms, most of them undocumented. In camps, resistance was often quiet and symbolic rather than openly violent. Prisoners shared food, cared for sick children, preserved cultural traditions, and maintained family bonds despite constant separation. One of the most significant acts of resistance occurred in Auschwitz-Birkenau. When Roma prisoners learned that liquidation of the family camp was imminent, they prepared to fight. Armed with improvised weapons, tools, stones, wooden boards, they refused to leave their barracks. This resistance reportedly forced SS guards to postpone the liquidation temporarily. Although it could not prevent the eventual massacre, it stands as a powerful reminder that Roma prisoners resisted their fate, even when defeat was inevitable. Women and children. Roma women faced unique forms of violence. In camps and labor facilities, they were subjected to sexual abuse, forced sterilization, and medical experiments. Many were separated from their children, often without ever seeing them again. Mothers struggled to keep children alive under impossible conditions. They shared food, improvised clothing, and attempted to protect children from selections and abuse. In many cases, children died in their arms from hunger or disease. Roma children who survived often did so alone. Orphaned, traumatized, and without documentation, many wandered across post-war Europe, invisible to authorities and aid organizations. Psychological trauma. Survival did not mean freedom from suffering. Roma survivors carried deep psychological scars: grief for murdered families, guilt for surviving, and trauma from years of dehumanization. Unlike other survivor groups, Roma often lacked access to support networks, legal recognition, or financial assistance after the war. Many returned to the same discriminatory conditions they had known before, now intensified by loss and poverty. Silence became a survival strategy. Many survivors rarely spoke about their experiences, even within their own families. Trauma was passed down through generations, shaping Roma identity in the post-war world. Liberation and displacement. When Allied forces liberated camps in 1944 to 1945, Roma prisoners were among the weakest and least prepared to rebuild their lives. Many were ill, malnourished, and without homes to return to. In some regions, Roma were not immediately freed. Local authorities continued to treat them as criminals or vagrants, detaining them even after the collapse of Nazi rule. Displaced Roma often moved across borders in search of relatives or safety. Without papers or property, they struggled to access aid or resettlement programs designed primarily for other populations. Testimonies and memory. Roma survivor testimonies were rarely collected in the immediate post-war years. Few historians, journalists, or courts sought out their stories. As a result, much of what we know today comes from later oral histories, often recorded decades after the events. These testimonies describe scenes of sudden arrests, mass shootings, hunger in camps, and the loss of entire families. They also speak of resilience, of songs whispered in barracks, shared memories, and the determination to remain human in inhuman conditions. For many survivors, telling their stories was an act of resistance against erasure. A genocide without justice. Despite surviving genocide, Roma victims were largely excluded from post-war justice processes. Many were denied recognition as victims of racial persecution and were instead labeled as criminals or asocials. Compensation programs in several countries explicitly excluded Roma or imposed requirements they could not meet. This denial compounded their suffering and reinforced the message that their lives mattered less. Only decades later did governments begin to acknowledge the genocide of the Roma and recognize it as part of the broader history of Nazi crimes. The Genocide of the Roma, Gypsies, in Nazi Europe. Part 5. Post-war silence, delayed recognition, and the struggle for memory. When the Second World War ended, the camps were liberated, and the Nazi regime collapsed. The genocide of the Roma did not truly end. For most survivors, liberation did not bring justice, safety, or recognition. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long period of silence, denial, and continued discrimination. While Europe rebuilt itself and documented the horrors of the war, the suffering of the Roma remained largely invisible. A return to discrimination. Roma survivors who attempted to return to their pre-war homes often found nothing left. Houses had been destroyed or taken by others. Communities had been wiped out. Entire family networks no longer existed. Instead of receiving support, many Roma encountered the same authorities who had persecuted them before and during the war. In several countries, post-war governments continued to enforce laws that treated Roma as criminals, vagrants, or a social problem. Police surveillance, forced settlements, and restrictions on movement persisted. For survivors, the line between wartime persecution and post-war discrimination was often indistinguishable. Exclusion from justice and compensation. One of the most painful aspects of the post-war period was the denial of justice. At war crimes trials, the genocide of the Roma was rarely addressed in detail. Roma victims were seldom called as witnesses, and crimes against them were often categorized as incidental or secondary. In compensation programs established in the late 1940s and 1950s, Roma were frequently excluded. Authorities argued that Roma had been persecuted for asocial behavior rather than racial reasons, a claim that ignored Nazi racial ideology and the documented policies of extermination. Many survivors lacked documents to prove their imprisonment or the deaths of family members. Entire families had been killed without records, leaving no evidence that met bureaucratic standards. Decades of silence. For decades, the genocide of the Roma had no widely accepted name, no memorial day, and little place in school curricula. Historians focused primarily on other aspects of the Holocaust, while Roma experiences were mentioned briefly, if at all. Within Roma communities, silence often prevailed. Trauma, fear of renewed persecution, and distrust of authorities discouraged survivors from speaking openly. Many believed that no one would listen, or that speaking would only bring further harm. As a result, the memory of the genocide survived mainly through oral tradition, passed quietly from generation to generation. The struggle for recognition. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, Roma activists, scholars, and survivors began to demand recognition of their suffering. They challenged official narratives and fought to have the genocide acknowledged as a racial crime. The term porajmos, meaning the devouring, gained wider usage as a way to name and define Roma experiences during the war. Memorial initiatives, conferences, and survivor testimonies slowly entered public discourse. In 1982, the German government formally recognized that Roma had been persecuted on racial grounds under Nazism. This acknowledgement, though long overdue, marked a turning point in official recognition. Memorials and remembrance. In recent decades, memorials dedicated to Roma victims have been established across Europe. One of the most significant stands in Berlin, honoring Roma and Sinti murdered under Nazi rule. August 2nd, the anniversary of the liquidation of the Roma family camp at Auschwitz, is now recognized as a day of remembrance in several countries. Ceremonies, educational programs, and survivor testimonies seek to ensure that the genocide is no longer forgotten. However, remembrance remains uneven. In many regions, Roma victims are still absent from national memorials and history textbooks. The legacy today. The legacy of the Roma genocide is not only historical, it is deeply connected to the present. Anti-Roma discrimination remains widespread in Europe, echoing centuries-old stereotypes that once enabled genocide. Remembering the porajmos is not only about honoring the dead, it is about recognizing the dangers of dehumanization, racism, and silence. It is a reminder of how easily prejudice can become policy, and how entire communities can be erased when society looks away. Conclusion. The genocide of the Roma in Nazi Europe was a crime of enormous scale and cruelty. Hundreds of thousands were murdered, entire communities destroyed, and a people pushed to the edge of annihilation. For decades, their suffering was ignored. Today, telling this story is an act of justice. It restores names to the nameless, voices to the silenced, and history to those from whom it was taken. The memory of the Roma genocide stands as a warning and as a call to remember all victims of hatred without hierarchy or exclusion.